October 13th, night. In Crimea, which had been marketed for 10 years by Russian propaganda as a safe haven, a paradise for vacationers, the lights of civilization suddenly went out. From Simferopol to Feodosia, from Sevastopol to Yalta, hundreds of thousands of people were plunged into absolute icy darkness in their homes, on the streets, and at their workplaces. This was not a simple power outage. This was the unplugging of modern life. For hundreds of thousands of Russians living in Crimea, that moment was when the war ceased to be just a news story on television screens and entered their homes, swallowing their lives. Heating systems shut down, refrigerators stopped, telephone networks collapsed. All communication with the outside world, all connections, were severed in an instant. When people rushed to their windows, trying to understand what had caused the darkness, they experienced a second shock on the eastern horizon. Giant flames, visible even from Feodosia kilometers away, rose into the sky, staining it red. This was not just a fire, it was a funeral pyre, burning alive all the peninsula's life energy, all its ability to move. The targets struck were not chosen at random. Ukraine, with the precision of a surgeon, had severed Crimea's two lifelines simultaneously. The main oil terminal in Feodosia, the heart pumping blood to the peninsula, and the main 330 and 220 kilovolt transformer stations in Simferopol and Feodosia, the main arteries distributing that blood from the heart to the entire body. That night, hundreds of thousands of Russians were not just left in the dark and cold. They did not yet know that they were trapped in a much bigger nightmare, a hell of entrapment, which would begin the next morning. The first light of day revealed a reality even more terrifying than the darkness of night. The darkness was merely a loss of comfort, but the flames in Feodosia signified something far more deadly. The fuel was gone. The news spread like wildfire, despite the collapsed communication lines. The peninsula's main fuel depot, along with tens of thousands of tons of gasoline and diesel inside, had been destroyed. At that moment, the myth of Crimea as a safe haven was shattered, replaced by pure, primal panic. Thousands, tens of thousands of people jumped into their cars with a single instinct: to flee. They stormed gas stations to reach the Kerch Bridge, their only way out. But at the stations, they were met with miles-long queues and the harsh reality at the pumps: no gas. These two words were a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of Russian settlers in Crimea. They realized there was no escape route left. They were trapped. Local media channels became centers of anger and helplessness that the Kremlin could not control. Leaked civilian videos showed people fighting each other for generator fuel, empty supermarket shelves, and the streets of Sevastopol and Simferopol plunged into pitch darkness at night, turning into ghost towns. Crimea, which Putin had presented 10 years earlier as sacred lands reunited with their historical homeland, was now a fuel-less, powerless, and hopeless island prison, trapped along with its inhabitants. That tacit social contract with the Russian people, give me political obedience and I will provide you with security and stability, had burned to ashes in the light of the flames rising from Feodosia on the night of October 13th. Stability was gone. Chaos had begun. So how did Putin's impregnable fortress, Crimea, supposedly protected by the world's most intense air defense systems, get dragged into this primitive chaos and helplessness overnight? The recipe for this total collapse was the result of months of planning, meticulous intelligence work, and the ingenious application of modern warfare doctrines. On the night of October 13th, with just 40 drones, the Ukrainian Security Service and Special Operations Forces, with surgical precision, targeted two vital organs of Crimea simultaneously, sending the entire system into shock. The goal was not just to hit military targets, but to destroy the two fundamental pillars on which a modern society rests, collapsing the entire structure from its foundations. The first and most burning cause of this chaos was the massive flames that lit up the sky in Feodosia that night. Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles targeted not only the largest, but also the most strategic oil terminal on the peninsula. This was not a simple storage facility. It was the logistical heart of Crimea. As confirmed by open-source intelligence analysts and data from NASA's FIRMS satellite fire detection system, this was the second, and far more destructive, attack on the facility within a week. While attempts were being made to repair the damage to 3 tanks that had been damaged in the previous attack and were still smoking, this latest strike resulted in complete destruction. According to a statement made by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense after the attack, which was also confirmed by Western intelligence sources, at least 5 tanks were blown up in the new attacks, and a total of 11 massive fuel tanks were destroyed. And the most critical detail, 10 of these tanks were filled to the brim with tens of thousands of tons of diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel that the Russian army had stockpiled to send to the front. Satellite images clearly showed the magnitude of the fire, and that the port was almost completely unusable. This was the destruction of the main pump of Crimea's circulatory system, leaving the peninsula bloodless, i.e., fuelless, and plunging it into an inevitable shock. That same night, the reason for the pitch-black darkness engulfing the peninsula was also targets chosen with the same surgical precision. Ukraine aimed to paralyze not only the lights but the entire nervous system. The swarm of UAVs had severed Crimea's 2 main arteries, its 2 main lifelines, simultaneously. The first target was the Kharkiv transformer station, a 220 kilovolt main hub that distributed electricity from mainland Russia to Crimea via the Kerch Bridge. This center was the most critical point supplying eastern Crimea and the Kerch Peninsula. The second and simultaneous target was the 330 kilovolt Simferopol transformer station, which supplied the peninsula's largest cities, such as Simferopol and Sevastopol, its most densely populated areas, and its most important military bases, along with the directly connected Tavricheskaya thermal power plant. The translation of this technical jargon into military and civilian language is simple. Ukraine had pulled the plug on Crimea. They had crippled the entire system by cutting the power grid, not like pruning the branches of a tree, but by cutting it directly at the trunk. These 2 attacks, fire and darkness, were not independent, random acts. This was a single, comprehensive, perfectly coordinated operation designed to render Crimea uninhabitable, both militarily and civilly. The goal was not to weaken the enemy gradually, but to put it into a coma in a single night. The ripple effect created by these 2 surgical strikes began to unravel civilian life and the social fabric in Crimea the very next morning, at a speed and with a violence unseen in a decade. This was not just a story of an infrastructure crisis, but of a crisis of confidence, a psychological breakdown, and the shattering of the false reality constructed by the Kremlin. Life literally stopped. The absence of electricity did not just mean lights going out and homes getting cold. It had much deeper and more devastating consequences. Hospitals, emergency rooms, and operating rooms became dependent on limited and unreliable generator power. Pumps feeding the water network stopped, and water stopped flowing from the taps in hundreds of thousands of homes. This situation further fueled uncertainty and panic. The fuel shortage made this paralysis absolute and irreversible. Daily life was paralyzed, with trucks carrying basic necessities such as food and medicine stuck on the roads. Even emergency vehicles, ambulances, and fire trucks could only respond to the most critical cases, fearing that their own fuel tanks would run dry. Under Kremlin control, Crimea ceased to be a modern society and turned into a huge crisis zone, an open-air prison where basic needs could not be met and the struggle for survival was fought on every street and in every home. However, the greatest destruction took place in the minds and hearts of Russians living in Crimea. Putin's tacit social contract with the Russian people was always based on a simple equation. Give me your political freedoms and your right to dissent, and in return, I will provide you with security, stability, and a measure of prosperity. For years, Kremlin propaganda presented Crimea as the shining example of this contract. Crimea was marketed as Russia's safest land, its impregnable fortress, its haven of peace. With this attack, that contract was painfully torn up before the eyes of hundreds of thousands of people. That night, stability was gone. The physical destruction of war had, for the first time, systematically and shockingly entered the homes, kitchens, and bedrooms of the Russian civilian population. Seeing how flimsy the walls of the fortress really were, how the vaunted systems failed to protect them, the people's trust in the state they believed would protect them was fundamentally shaken. Fear quickly gave way to anger, uncertainty, and a sense of betrayal. While the Kremlin-controlled media remained silent, local media channels became centers of panic and rebellion that the regime could no longer control. This was damage too deep to be destroyed by missiles and bombs, and it marked the beginning of the irreversible collapse of the Russian internal front in Crimea. And this chaos, this social paralysis experienced by the civilian population like a mirror, turned directly into the paralysis of the Russian army on the peninsula itself, without delay and with much greater intensity. Because a modern army, no matter how powerful and technological, is a parasite on the civilian infrastructure it operates on. It is lit by its electricity, moves on its fuel, and uses its roads. Every crisis that halts civilian life hits the army much harder and much more deadly. Ukraine's strategy was based on exploiting this fundamental and brutal truth. The fuel that the civilian population couldn't find at gas stations also couldn't fill the tanks of the T-90 tanks, BMP-3 armored vehicles, and Grad rocket systems in their barracks. Without fuel, those vaunted war machines, costing billions of dollars, become piles of rusting metal, unable to take a single step outside their barracks. Logistics convoys, which were supposed to transport ammunition, food, and soldiers to the front, were stopped before they even set out. Su-30 fighter jets and Kar-52 attack helicopters at critical air bases such as Belbek and Gvardeyskoye, even if they had full tanks, were doomed to remain on the tarmac as easy targets, unable to take off without the fuel tankers and ground services to support them. Most importantly, the last remnants of the once feared Black Sea Fleet, anchored in Sevastopol, have lost their ability to defend themselves or launch an attack by leaving the ports. Without fuel, they were no longer warships, but merely floating targets. The tens of thousands of Russian occupation forces in Crimea had, overnight, completely lost their mobility, the most fundamental element of their ability to fight. The power outage, which left cities in darkness, also blacked out the screens of command and control centers. The high-tech systems that generals and colonels use to monitor the situation at the front in real time, identify targets, and relay orders suddenly fell silent. Backup generators could perhaps keep the lights on for a while, but these generators themselves depended on diesel fuel, which was now unavailable. And the most critical blow, without electricity, the radar stations, the brains of the S-400 and Panzer air defense systems, considered impenetrable, would be blind. An army that cannot see its enemy, communicate with its commanders, or move is no longer an army. It is merely a disorganized crowd of tens of thousands waiting to be destroyed. As a result, on the night of October 13th, the Russian army in Crimea lost both its muscles, its ability to move, and its nervous system, its command and control capabilities, at the same time. Civil chaos inevitably led to military paralysis. So how was all this possible, despite the so-called impenetrable air defense shield over Crimea, which Putin had spent billions of dollars to build, and which he had presented to the world as a power to be reckoned with in propaganda films and military parades? This question represents the greatest embarrassment, the biggest fiasco, and the most painful reality of this crisis for the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin himself. Hours after the attack, the familiar statement from the Russian Defense Ministry, that feeble admission that dozens of Ukrainian UAVs were successfully destroyed over Crimea, was actually a manifesto of their own defeat. While boasting about shooting down dozens of decoy UAVs, they were admitting that they had failed to prevent the real strike UAVs, which cut off all the lifelines of the peninsula from hitting all the most valuable and critical targets with precision. This was like boasting about repairing a few bricks on the outer walls of your castle while your treasury and command center were blown to smithereens. Behind this fiasco lies the victory of technological asymmetry and tactical innovation, which are rewriting the rules of modern warfare. This was not a brute force attack, it was a clear victory of intellect and technology over brute force and cumbersome doctrine. According to leaked Ukrainian military documents and assessments by Western military analysts, the tactical genius of the operation was based on a multi-layered deception. Ukraine had spent months analyzing how Russian air defense systems worked, what frequencies their radars used, and how slow their decision-making processes were. On the night of the attack, they ruthlessly exploited these weaknesses. The first waves consisted of dozens of cheap decoy UAVs programmed to be perceived as a threat by Russian radars, but which actually only emitted noise and false signals. Russian S-400 and Panzer batteries locked onto these fake targets, wasting their valuable missiles, each worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, on these phantoms in the sky, completely saturating their systems and confusing the operators. It was precisely during this moment of chaos that the real striking force, far more advanced kamikaze drones equipped with AI, assisted navigation systems, low radar signatures, and the ability to autonomously perform final approaches to their targets, slipped through the blind spots and corridors opened in the defense network. These drones struck the pre-identified critical transformer stations and oil tanks with surgical precision, encountering almost no resistance. This was the moment the Kremlin's propaganda bubble was burst. This event certified the absolute failure of Russia's expensive, cumbersome, and centralized defense doctrine against Ukraine's cheap, smart, flexible, and network-centric approach to warfare. Ukraine did not just strike Crimea, it also struck the great myth surrounding Russian military technology and doctrine. This total collapse has placed Putin and the Kremlin in a deadlock on the chessboard, a strategic checkmate situation with no solution, where every move results in a loss. Crimea was the crowning jewel of Putin's 20-year rule, the brightest gem in the imperial crown he won with the 2014 annexation. That jewel first burned in the flames of Feodosia on the night of October 13th, then sank into the darkness that engulfed the entire peninsula, and finally cracked into thousands of pieces amid the panic of the people and the helplessness of the army. A leader who cannot even protect the center of his own propaganda, his own victory monument, a region he declared sacred soil of the motherland, can no longer present an image of a strong leader to the world or his own people. This is a loss of prestige far deeper, more lasting, and irreversible than a military defeat. This is the most fatal blow to Putin's charisma and aura of invincibility. So what will the future bring after this strategic impasse? This attack has left the Russian army and civilian population in Crimea dependent on a single fragile lifeline, a single airway. The Kerch Bridge, which is constantly targeted by Ukrainian missiles, naval drones, and special forces, and has become nearly impossible to defend. By destroying all alternative energy sources, all reserve fuel depots, and all logistics centers on the peninsula, Ukraine has made more than 2 million people and tens of thousands of soldiers dependent on this single, weak artery. This means the stage is perfectly set for the final and greatest blow, the complete destruction of the bridge. The Kremlin will now be forced to pour all its defense resources, its most advanced air defense systems, and all its attention into this single point, this 19-kilometer concrete structure, in order to keep Crimea alive. And this will leave it much weaker and more vulnerable to attacks on Ukraine's other fronts. This is like forcing your opponent in chess to protect a single square with all their pieces while you take over the rest of the board. It's a checkmate situation, and Putin has no winning moves left in this game. The beginning of the end for Crimea did not start with a general's order or a tank's gunfire. It began with the helplessness of a mother whose phone doesn't work, a father without internet, and a desperate driver at a gas station in a house with no electricity. Ukraine is conquering Crimea, its rightful territory, from within. Thank you for choosing us.